So I'm going to be talking about Hearst versus Pulitzer, and obviously, as you probably know, these are two editors from history that started big publication empires. So I'm just going to start. This is Joseph Pulitzer. He was born in Hungary, and he's kind of a misfit in school. Didn't really find his place. His father died very early. He didn't have a father figure, and so he had a hard time kind of fitting in and finding his place in the world. So at an early age, he went out and traveled all over Europe, and when he was a teenager and when he was eligible, he decided that he wanted to join the army. He was actually declined by both the Hungarian and the British armies because he was kind of a bitch. Like, he was a tiny little guy, and he had bad eyesight. So when he was in Germany, he met a group of American soldiers who were recruiting, and the only army in the world that would recruit him was the American army. So he fought for a couple of years, but then he had to drop out. He was released on honorable discharge. After the war, he moved to St. Louis. He was Hungarian, like I said, and so he moved to St. Louis, which had a big Hungarian and German population, and he started working at an American-German newspaper covering immigrant politics because he was one. Journalism was kind of considered a joke profession back in the day. It wasn't really taken very seriously, and so when he started at this newspaper, his charge was to change that and to make journalism a respected profession. And so the first thing that he did when he was at the newspaper was make it his mission to expose all the corruption that was happening in the city. Like, St. Louis was a totally corrupt city, monopolies and bank scandals and lots of different stuff going on. So he started publishing the tax records of the wealthiest people in the city who were saying that they had no money. And what else? Oh, he made campaign contributions public. And in 1911, he actually broke up Standard Oil by exposing the monopoly that they had that was illegal. So he didn't really do anything too crazy that we think of now, but all that information is public, but he was the first person to do it. So he really set a standard for integrity in journalism. Yeah, work it. So he did such a good job there that he was named managing editor of the paper, and he was given partial ownership of it. He started making like a shit ton of money all of a sudden, really fast, and so he acquired the St. Louis Dispatch newspaper, and he acquired this newspaper in particular. He was a smart guy. It was an afternoon paper, and he noticed that in his time, people were commuting home from either the farms or the cities. They didn't have the subway. They were going by trolley. So they were commuting home, and they wanted something to entertain themselves. People also had more access to electricity and gas lights, so they could read at night. So his decision to buy this paper was strategic in that more people were reading afternoon papers than morning papers. And let's see, so he actually decided that he wanted to pursue newspapers, and that was his calling in life, and he was very passionate about it. And so he moved to New York City in 1882, and he left his partner to run the papers back in St. Louis. As soon as he got to the city, he bought the New York World, and he bought a 16-story building to furnish the paper with employees and maintenance. And at the time, it was the largest building in New York City. So it was a major undertaking. So before Pulitzer, newspapers were kind of boring. Not that they're extremely exciting now, but they were boring back then. It was kind of just cut and paste. You'd have to read a whole document, a letter from London, just to get a detail about an event that happened over there. Very wordy, no real mix between visual and words. So he brought a new style to the editorial world. He started putting more visuals in his papers, big headlines, kind of punchy headlines, that kind of thing. He also started reporting on celebrities and sports, and like I said before, he was an expert in crime and corruption, so he started reporting on that as news, and it wasn't just world, international news that was being covered. He also reported a lot on immigrant news, and he would kind of dignify them and dignify their lives by profiling their stories and sharing them with the world. I mean, after all, he was one of them, so he did sympathize with the immigrants, and in turn, they bought his papers and were a major revenue source for him. So his paper was widely circulated in New York City. It was the most circulated, and I found a statistic that said if the New York Times today wanted to be as influential as Joseph Pulitzer's New York World was back then, they'd have to increase their circulation by 300%. We also have Pulitzer to thank for Our Lady Liberty. He was the first major source of, or major example of crowdsourcing. He crowdsourced his readers and raised $300,000 to build the base and the site for Lady Liberty. I mean, obviously we know the French, it was a gift from the French, but there was no place to put it, so he set up the base, and he also made the site on the island. So thank you, Pulitzer, for Lady Liberty. And until then, his motto, his journalistic motto was accuracy, terseness, accuracy. But there was one man who would make him forget his standards. And that's William Randolph Hearst. So his story is a little different. He was born in California, rich parents. He was born to a very sophisticated mother, and his father was loaded because he was part of all three of the biggest gold mine digs in American history, all which took place in California. So he was loaded, yeah. And his father owned one of the papers in San Francisco. And so that's how he got his first exposure to newspapers. So he went off to Harvard to study journalism, but got kicked out because he was peeing in chamber pots and then sending them to his professors as a prank. So they expelled him from Harvard. He went back to California with his family, and he took over his father's paper, which was losing money. So his father didn't care. He was like, take it, it's yours, operate it, whatever. He was so passionate about journalism and about the newspaper industry that he also, like Pulitzer, decided that he wanted to pursue it full-time and make it his career. So he moved to New York City. That's when things started to get a little dicey. His first job was actually at the New York World with Joseph Pulitzer. And Pulitzer taught him how to write and how to sell and how to market newspapers. He kind of taught him all the tricks of the trade by combining investigative journalism and sensational news. The fusion of those two, he said, made good newspapers. So just a lay of the land of kind of the journalistic environment at that time, newspapers were the only source of news. There was no TV, there was no Facebook. I mean, it sounds like hell, but like all there were newspapers. There were 18 in circulation in New York City. There were, and something to appeal to everyone. There were highbrow papers, there were the trash rags, afternoon papers, morning papers, everything. So that's where people were getting their news, and that's why it was such a competitive environment. So while Hearst was working for Pulitzer, he himself created kind of a unique style of reporting, which was called blitzing a story. And it was where he would send out a team of 10 or 20 people onto a site and have them talk to different people at the event. So if it was experts, it was victims, it was spectators, and he realized that he could generate 5 or 6 stories and splatter them all over the cover of the front page just from one happening. So that happened, and then kind of in conjunction with that, his father died. So the father left him a ton of money and gave him part of his inheritance. So Hearst decided that he was going to take on his mentor, Joseph Pulitzer, just head on. He was like, I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to take you on, and I'm going to win. So he really fronted the frontmaster on this. He actually also, the first thing he did after he he decided to create his own newspaper was he was a charming guy. He got his friends over at the Fourth Estate, which was another publication in New York City, to publish his intentions and basically announce that it was on and that he was going to be taking on Joseph Pulitzer, opening up his own newspaper. His big hardo move. So Pulitzer fired back, and he just called Hearst an unoriginal imitator of Pulitzers Style. So this is when the war between the two officially began. So at the time, Pulitzer was running a comic strip called Hogan's Alley, which was had a lot of notoriety and was getting very popular because it was this kid down at the bottom, the yellow kid, and every comic he would have stuff written on his shirt that was all commentary about New York City living. He was called the Yellow Kid, officially or unofficially, and actually historians cite him as the first example of modern merchandising because his image was everywhere. It was on cigarettes, it was on playing cards, it was on, it was mass produced, and it was a major source of revenue for them. And this is the first example of some of the other things that we see today, where there's a kiddish appeal that appeals to adults and makes a ton of money. So Richard Oakholt was Hogan's Alley's illustrator, and he was also becoming as famous as the comic strip was. And so Hearst, in his aggressive style, wooed Oakholt into coming over to the newspaper that Hearst had just created, which was called the New York Journal. He did that, and he also stole 2 of Pulitzer's top editors. So he pulled 3 people over, and later more. To add insult to injury, he also started charging 1 penny for his paper, which would be the equivalent of like $1.52 or $53 today. So he was charging less than anyone in New York City. So people were buying his papers. He had just gotten the hottest illustrator in town. So Pulitzer followed suit. Game on. And let's see here. The illustrator actually went to Congress and tried to file an official copyright file for this yellow kid, saying that it's ours so that they could have exclusive rights to it, but in the end he filed it wrong, and all he got rights to were the name The Yellow Kid. In the months that followed, they basically were just head-to-head. I mean, they were trying to just outperform, outsell, outmarket, outspeak, outpublish, out-everything each other. They hated each other. So there was one editor, people were noticing, there was one editor that he ran the New York Press. His name was Evan Wardman. He noticed what was going on. And he also noticed that the integrity of the journalism and the quality of the articles was declining drastically because all they cared about was out-publishing each other. So for a long time, he was trying to come up with a name for it. What are we going to call this? This is something. This is a trend. He knew that something was happening in the journalism world. So he came up with new journalism, he came up with new journalism, and as soon as the 2 publishers finally sank so low that they started replacing actual news with this comic strip, he found his name. It was Yellow Journalism. Okay, so then the Spanish-American War hit, and just to give you like the story in 60 on that, basically, so Spain owned Cuba, and Spain was running out of money, so they were kind of squeezing Cuba for every last penny they had because it was a major source of sugarcane crops and revenue. And the Cuban people didn't like that. It's like the Americans. They didn't want that. They didn't want the Spanish people in their country. They didn't want them taking the money that they had earned. So they rebelled, and there was a revolution in Cuba. So Hearst kind of sympathized with them. After all, he was an American, and America did become a country after they revolted against the British Empire. So he felt very passionate about the cause, and he started kind of drumming the cause of the rebels into his paper over and over and over again, trying to rally support and get support among his readers. And so the way that he did that, because he knew that he didn't have much of a cause because America was in no way involved, was he would start publishing these headlines like, women strip searched by Spanish government and and American citizens were, I mean, he was just completely fabricating these headlines, but the people were loving it, and they were buying his papers, and they were totally eating it up. So obviously, again, Pulitzer did the same thing, and this started a completely perpetual cycle. It's like the more sensational the headline in the story, the more newspapers sold. So some of the biggest, just to give you an example of how outrageous these headlines would get, it's like nothing you would ever get away with today. Some of the biggest news stories concern this general, the Spanish general who was down there. His name was Butcher Wayland, and a little background on him. He was basically the person who invented the concentration camp. He implemented a movement in Cuba called the Reconstruction Plan, which was meant to move civilians out of the way and put them into certain areas that he could target, him and his army could target the rebels and the people that they needed to kill or conquer. But it really backfired on him because all of the people that he moved were dying from starvation and no water and disease, mass disease. So he ended up killing 10% of the Cuban population between the rebels and the non-rebels. So both of the papers, Pulitzer's and Hearst, started referring to him as the Butcher and started making up stories about his personality and his personal life. And they were both rushing to send teams down there to Cuba to get the news. And some of them made it. Most of them ended up in Florida, but some of them did actually make it down to Cuba. But most of them that actually made it down to Cuba were staying at this American hotel with other American journalists who weren't getting any access to the actual news stories. So, I mean, they'd hear whispers of things and send them back to Hearst and Pulitzer and be like, this is big news, whether or not they knew it was true. So a lot of this was fabricated, and one of the headlines that they actually ran, just to give you an example, like I said, refined young women stripped and searched by brutal Spaniards while Spaniards wave our flag. This is an example of one of the headlines they ran. So you can see kind of how ridiculous and far-fetched sounding they were. I mean, it's something that you'd never get away with. Everything was about luring readers in those times. Next. Nope, next. Okay, so all of this is bad. It was very bad, but the worst of it was yet to come. This is the USS Maine, one of the battleships that was down in Cuba, and it exploded unexpectedly during the war. To this day, nobody really knows why it exploded, but it's regarded as the single most influential and exploited news story of the Spanish-American War and also of yellow journalism this time period. So it blew up, and immediately following the explosion, Hearst and Pulitzer both ran headlines immediately accusing the Spanish. Bombs aboard, they're trying to kill President McGinley, they're trying to get us Americans, no American is safe in Cuba, that kind of thing. Other headlines were like, remember the war, and they even went so far as to publish headlines like, war, sure, and other things about just, let's get them. So nobody had any confirmed details, but again, they were all about the selling of papers. And it's interesting to think, though, about what would have happened if one of them or both of them had disapproved of the war and how different the course of history would have gone, because they wanted war and they wanted it bad. So, there's no slide here. So in the end, the U.S. defeated Spain and Cuba gained its independence. But it's interesting to see, to think about who really won the war between Hearst and Pulitzer. On the one hand, strictly looking at numbers, by the time both of them were dead, Hearst's paper had much more circulation. But if we're looking at other assets, on the one hand, we've got Pulitzer's paper, which shut down in 1931. We've got the Pulitzer Prize, which is, as you know, an award that's given to the best of the best in journalism, art, and music. We've also got the World Almanac and later the Farmer's Almanac, which Pulitzer and his team gave us. And last but not least, we've got Lily Pulitzer, the fashionista. And then on the other hand, we've got Hearst. He gives us our beach reads. He also was the inspiration for Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, regarded as the greatest movie of all time. And another thing that he did was built a badass mansion while he was alive. I was Google imaging this thing. It's out of control. It's got like 12 pools. It's huge, and it actually looks like a castle. That's the front of it. And to this day, from the time that Hearst died until today, it is the single most visited and most profitable tourist site in California. It's a major deal. So I don't know who you got. Who was more successful?
Pulitzer. Yeah, who's their dick?
I don't know. I think they were both assholes. I mean, we can't argue though that they were both major influences on the journalism world, and they had a major impact on how we read the news today. I mean, I don't know about you, but I would not be as well educated on Kim Kardashian's pregnancy and the whole Kim Ye marriage if it weren't for these guys. So I personally can thank them. No. All right, it's not moving. That's the end. That's all I've got.